Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. When the writer Adam Langer interviewed Laura Albert for Interview Magazine, he said that she anticipated just about all of it. Long before we had split our personalities in the lives we truly live and the images that we choose to create, our personas on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and everywhere else, Albert created her own avatar. Before the lingo of gender fluidity and transgender identity became commonplace, Albert was writing novels and stories under the name of J.T. Leroy, a former teenage West Virginia truck stop prostitute who made his way to San Francisco and wrote the novel Sarah and the short story collection, The Heart is Deceitful Above All Things. Those books were published in 2000 and 2001, respectively, and have since been reissued by HarperCollins and recently released as audiobooks. Laura Albert has spoken extensively about gender variance and transgender issues for such sources as Bomb Magazine, Ireland's Minefield Literary Stage, Dot 429, and others. Her writing has brought her to an array of speaking engagements from the storytelling series The Moth in New York to Foyle's bookstore in London and Brazil's International Bienal Brasil do Livro e da Leitura, where Laura and Alice Walker were the U.S. representatives, and there was a hit Brazilian rock musical about Laura and J.T. Leroy. Laura is also the subject of Jeff Herzig's feature documentary Author, The J.T. Leroy Story, and Lynn Hirschman Lesson's film, The Ballad of J.T. Leroy. Please welcome with her keynote address of Rethinking Transgression, ladies, gentlemen, and anyone who chooses to identify differently than those passé and preconceived notions, Laura Albert.
How is it coming across? Is it okay? Are you good?
Excellent.
Yeah?
Yep, you're sounding good, Laura.
Okay, great. First of all, oh God, Wendell, thank you so much. This is like super cool. I knew you from quite a while back, and it's really moving when people from the past reconnect with me and tell me how my work and the way I chose to present it has affected them and they've moved forward in their art. And I have to say, I'm really impressed by the UVU invitation, investigate us, because there aren't many people these days saying investigate us. So that's pretty darn cool. So I want to say it's an honor to be here, and I really wish I could be joining you in person. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to thank Professor Wendell Nielsen and everyone at Utah Valley University, especially our Discord master, Brigham Dunford. He is so patient. I appreciate all the effort that has gone into my participation in this transgression symposium. There's a lot of tongue twisters. Transgression, it's something, I have problems with that word. Okay, so I'll be discussing transgressive behavior in a range of contexts: cultural, social, sexual. But gender will be the principal subject that will recur in this talk. I'd like to start, however, simply by defining our terms and taking a look at the distinction between being transgressive and being aggressive. Vocabulary.com tells us that aggression is hostile, purposely unfriendly behavior that can sometimes be violent, from the Latin root word aggressionum, the Latin word for attack. More specifically, since the 17th century, aggression has been used to mean an unprovoked attack. Transgression is something that is against a law or command, and its Latin origins is the word transgredi, to step or pass over. Transgredi. In the field of geology, a transgression is what happens when the sea level rises and the shoreline recedes, which has happened many times as a natural process. That's what interests me. To what degree is the behavior we call transgressive baked into us? Because if transgression takes the form of rebellion, in other words, transgression as aggression, then all we have to do to make all we have to do to end the aggression, to make the rebels vanish and make the transgressive behavior disappear is to eliminate or reform whatever is being rebelled against. But consider gender transgression. No matter what social reformations take place, gender variant people will continue to be gender variant, whether or not the greater non-variant society knows that this is happening. The need to express oneself in this way comes naturally to some people, and it will keep occurring. But if this is natural for the people who do it, we then have to start wondering, is gender variance transgressive? Is it called? It's called transgressive, but is it? We'll take a close look at that question toward the end of this talk. Here, let's stick with the questions of rebelling and the merging of transgression with aggression. I'm going to read you a short passage from my current manuscript. Sorry, I have to scroll. It's not my good skill. It takes place around 1984 when I was a teenager and I was in foster care in a group home. I was also into the punk scene then. When I was a punk, I wanted people to stare, to know I was not down with the system, to wonder that my appearance could make them think, could get a reaction was nicotine to me. I wanted them to know I'm an angry political statement. Peace signs, beads, and flowers didn't do shit. But the rage of punk, that was harder for people to ignore. I would walk against traffic, so when cars and buses idled at a traffic light, their gazes would gravitate toward me. A display of everything from fascination to contempt to naked curiosity. I would let my jacket flap open so they could clearly read my t-shirt, my favorite being Jodie Foster's Army, a cartoon of a gun held up to a drawing of Reagan's head. Underneath the caption read, "Hinckley had a vision." Once when I was wearing this t-shirt, going up to a friend's apartment in her elevator, across from me was an older man dressed in leisure wear, making it clear he was perturbed by my shirt. I'm sure he had optimum viewing vantage, swiveling diagonally toward him. After making gasping, grunting badger snorts of disgust, he poked his finger toward me. "You!" He searched for words, his face turnip rose. "You smell!" he pronounced. I flushed with pride. "Sir, I do believe you can do better," I bowed to him. "That's the hippie stereotype. And, sir, that was the 60s. This is the 80s. I am not a hippie, and I'm rather clean, I assure you. My scent is delightful." I beamed at him while his entire body trembled. "But Reagan, that guy is a pig and truly does fucking stink," I said as the elevator door opened for me. The man let out a growling shriek of curses behind me as I exited. He clearly felt menaced in some way, and I, like a mouth-yammering, all-consuming Pac-Man, gobbled up his fear, and I was energized by his perceiving me as a substantial, glorious threat. Did something happen? Is everything okay? Okay. All right, thank you. Out in the world, politically, climate crisis, that's all good too? All right, I'll go on. Today, if I search offensive t-shirts online, I see things that I think are revolting and shameful. For that man in the elevator, my teenage t-shirt pinched exactly the same nerve. But for someone to lose it that badly over a t-shirt, I'd done nothing else. I was just wearing it. For him to take offense, not just visually and conceptually, but on an olfactory level, indicates something mechanical at work. A mechanism has replaced the thinking and evaluating mind, the rational mind. Conditioning, the activation of a conditioned response as opposed to a personal or authentic response. That is the root of the difficulty here. as it is with so many obstacles we encounter. But these hindrances could be overcome if we could change the way we think. And the example of transgressive behavior in whatever field can open the door for someone to do exactly that, to think in a new way, to rethink what the boundaries are. So your only guarantee in life is there will be ceaseless fucking change. And so your capacity not to be insistent and attach yourself, your ability to rethink things, this is not just useful, it's a matter of life and death. It'll be very hard to get through life if you can't be responsive to the changes around you. My piece that I read looks at the notion of fashion being not just transgressive, but aggressive. The fact is, we live in a highly regimented society, particularly when it comes to your presentation, what you wear, how you look. The only people who might not make judgments about you based on your presentation are probably people who can't see you. The composer and musician Louis Hardin gained international fame calling himself Moondog. He recorded amazing albums in the 1950s and 60s, years when he was frequently homeless in New York City. He was also blind and used Braille to write poetry and compose music. He lost his eyesight at the age of 16. He found a detonating cap among some railroad tracks, and it exploded in his face. After Moondog's accident, he was no longer distracted by how people presented themselves. That freedom eventually led him to undertake what he called a rebellion against organized fashion. He would stand around different street corners in the midtown business districts of Manhattan. That's where he knew the conformities were the strictest, and he would be dressed in his own version of traditional Viking regalia, a helmet with horns holding a spear. He was concerned that corporate profit was attempting to control not just how people dressed and how they appear, but how people behave and think as well, how we conceptualize and recognize ourselves as others, how we locate ourselves. The greater the organized social pressures to conform, the more rebellions inevitably arise, because people start to feel like they're living in a fucking prison. Oscar Wilde was actually sent to fucking prison. That happened in 1895, and he served the maximum, a sentence of 2 years hard labor for a crime then called acts of gross indecency with other male persons, homosexuality. And in his prison cell, he wrote De Profundis, which is one of the great spiritual documents of the 19th century. This is what he had to say about rebellion. It gets right to the heart of the matter. British actor, director, writer Neil Bartlett will read it to you. In 2016, Bartlett went to Reading Prison, where Wilde had been incarcerated. And he read the entire text of De Profundis to a live audience. I'm going to play a short section from the video of that reading. You'll see a door propped up behind Bartlett. That was the actual door to what had been Oscar Wilde's cell when he wrote De Profundis.
And though at present my friends may find it a hard thing to believe, it is true nonetheless that for them living in freedom and idleness and comfort, it is more easy to learn the lessons of humility than it is for me, who begins the day by going down on my knees and washing the floor of my cell. For prison life, with its endless privations and restriction, makes one rebellious. The most terrible thing about it is not that it breaks one's heart. Hearts are made to be broken, but that it turns one's heart to stone. One sometimes feels that it is only with a front of brass and a lip of scorn that one can get through the day at all. And he who is in a state of rebellion cannot receive grace, to use the phrase of which the church is so fond, so rightly fond, I dare say. For in life, as in art, the mood of rebellion closes up the channels of the soul and shuts out the airs of heaven. Yet I must learn these lessons here if I am to learn them anywhere.
Wilde was a huge celebrity. He had been at the vanguard of his society in matters of letters and aesthetics at the time he was imprisoned. And almost everyone turned their backs on him. He certainly understood rage and rebellion, but he also understood grace. Why grace was needed, how grace can carry you through the most dire situations. And we all have the capacity to receive grace, to be an instrument of grace. But for that to happen, you gotta be open and feel acceptance of what's around you, of yourself and of others. The more fixated you are on an aggressive agenda, especially, I must take down my enemy, the more you gotta shut yourself down. It's like aiming a rifle. You have to close one eye and squint as you peer through the scope. All sorts of things have to stop and be sealed off inside you. A universe of thoughts and feelings and connections and meanings has to be banished if you're to bring the laser-like focus necessary to take down your enemy. And we are presented with endless justifications for being filled with rebellious rage at supposed enemies. You don't have to leave your home to scroll. It's overwhelming, the sheer quantity of offenses, cruelties, injustices, venalities, stupidities. But to quote Oscar again, this time from The Picture of Dorian Gray, a man cannot be too careful in his choice of enemies. You need to give some thought to which options you choose. There are grievance wars out there which can suck you in 24/7. If you are going to be an activist and fight effectively for the changes that are needed, you should be very clear what you're opposing and why. The 1953 film, The Wild One, stars Marlon Brando as a motorcycle riding troublemaker. And there's a beat. A young woman asks what he's rebelling against.
Tell me what that means. BRMC. What does it mean?
Black Rebels Motorcycle Club.
Isn't that cute? Hey, Johnny, what are you rebelling against?
What do you got?
That's his answer. What do you got? It's pretty much, or what do you got? It's pretty much impossible to be persuasive if you're attacking. The real challenge is to create a situation where people can raise the visor on their armor and allow an opportunity to engage them more authentically. And it's very hard to draw that out if you're busy and clap back on social media and getting in their face. The Wild One was produced by Stanley Kramer, who came to be known as the filmmaker of social protest and provocation, especially after directing such films as The Defiant Ones, On the Beach, Inherent the Wind, and Judgment at Nuremberg. But he himself was the first to admit that the most impact his work could have is if two people walked out of the theater and one said to the other, I never thought of it that way. I never thought of it quite that way before. There are different paths to that point of openness and honest reflection depending on the individual, but you cannot get someone there by threatening them. That man in the elevator who lost it because of my Jodie Foster's Army t-shirt, I succeeded in making him see me as a threat. And Marlon Brando's flippant answer in his is also a threat to everyone who fears what his character represents. His answer is a literal question. What have you got? What have you gotten out of all of this? What keeps it together for you that isn't fear-based and consumer-driven? What do you got? When people cannot answer that question, they become increasingly fixated on social conformities because they require something external to provide form, to show them who they are and what they're supposed to do. The pressure to conform, in turn, generates rebellion, and we start to fall into an endless reactive cycle, one pulling against the other and thereby intensifying the other, like dancing in a mosh pit. You don't really dance, but if you're outside this dynamic and can observe, the first thing you realize is these two need each other desperately. Each one is locating themselves, defining themselves in terms of the other. I'm not like them, I'm like us. But is it possible to be both them and us? Is it possible to be neither them nor us? Well, as far as that closed loop is concerned, the answer is no. None of it is possible. You've got to be them or us. Earlier this month, the Republican National Committee censored Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for participating with Democrats in a congressional committee to investigate the violence at Capitol Hill on January 6, 2021, an event that the committee referred to as legitimate political discourse. If the RNC is successful in achieving total uniformity of thought, you'll see an embracing of even wilder distortions and lies and pushing legislation even more cruel and extreme. Even when they do not believe what they're selling, they fully expect you to buy their bullshit. There are business interests making money off whatever them or us argument is going down. People who get caught within them, that reactive dance, eventually discover how much it demands and takes from them and what they've had to give up. This is Orson Welles in an interview from October of 1985, just 8 days before his death at the age of 70.
Because they took my next picture away from me and butchered the end of it, I was going to show them that they were wrong. And I have spent the rest of my life showing people, trying to prove that what is said is wrong. And that's been an enormous waste of spirit and of energy.
Spirit, energy, vitality, it's very damaging to waste them. And our opportunities to do that, to waste and scatter them, are fucking endless. Because there are business interests ready to exploit your personal losses. And if you have turned the other into an object, then you have objectified and commodified yourself as well. There's no way to avoid. It has to happen. That's the coin you're trading in, and that's the coin in which you'll be paid. You become a type of market that will require its own equipment and clothing and gatherings and social media, a market that all sorts of people will be ready to exploit. There's a way of seeing that does not oppose things, but rather seeks to integrate them. When you do that, you aren't abandoning one side by insisting on the other, because the truth is they're interrelated. Whenever you're presented with a pair of opposites, there is a point of balanced clarity between the two. Now, here's the catch. If you insist upon your own brand of balanced clarity, you start to dry up its fluidity. And once it's hardened, it's no longer a point of balanced clarity between two opposites. Instead, it has become one side of a new set of opposites. What's needed is an open mind. But how do you fucking get there? Sun Ra, the great jazz composer musician, spoke of this often with the members of his band, which he called the orchestra. He was interested in each person's capacity to quiet the consciousness and be led by spirit. And he taught his musicians to locate spirit by stopping thought, abandoning knowledge, and trusting intuition. When spirit takes over, you don't make mistakes. To fuck up is human. Spirit never fucks up. Sun Ra believed that everything should be done through spirit, because the mind can't be trusted. You can always lose your mind, but never your spirit. Led by spirit, you become who you really are. One metaphor Sun Ra used was how a battery works. It has negative and positive polarities. An arc exists between them. And in the arc, he said there's a small space in the middle, the narrow. He saw the narrow as the point you should reach. So you won't make positive or negative judgments to spirit. Sun Ra named his band the Orchestra as a biblical pun, like Noah's Ark. His orchestra was doing more than preserving a life force. It was maintaining an active, direct communication with transcendent spirit. So they were capable of sailing unscathed through that deluge of death known as modern consumer society of the second half of the 20th century. But perhaps Sun Ra was also thinking about that electrical arc and the capacity for openness, represented by its narrow, not making positive or negative judgments, remaining open and available to achieving things that you can't even imagine, but which are possible through the guidance of spirit. In the classical circular image of yin yang, you have representation of all forms of negative and positive polarities: female and male, darkness and light, cold and heat, water and fire, attraction and repulsion, death and life, the material and spiritual. But there is a white drop in the black field and a black drop in the white field. Yin contains something of yang and yang contains something of yin. Negative and positive are polarities, but they are also interrelated. Positive actions can have negative consequences, and negative actions can have positive consequences. How many people win a fortune and then their life goes to shit? How many people lose everything but discover the freedom to enter into a new phase of their life and find satisfaction, success, and everlasting bliss? In this talk, I'm trying to equip you with the tools you'll need so you can cope with opposing polarities and not take on an either or mindset, because that limits your perception. I was curious how Google would translate the Latin transgredi, the origin of our word transgression, into English. Google translation was go beyond, which strikes me as a meaningful way to conceptualize transgression, going beyond laws or commandments, going beyond what we're used to. The need to go beyond also informs our understanding of art, to go further in our imagination, to see the connections between things that appear isolated. We engage works that are totally separate from ourselves, from different cultures and eras. We recognize something of ourselves in them. We know ourselves better because of them, because we were able to go beyond what we thought was our limits. We know the human spirit more deeply because of the films made by Kurosawa in Japan 50, 60, 70 years ago. We watch the tragic plays of Sophocles, first performed over 2,400 years ago, and we see our own dilemmas of the individual's free will, confronting the iron laws of the state and of the gods. But even if creating art is not your thing, the capacity to go beyond is essential to our culture. How can anyone cure disease? How can we explore space or train for the Olympics if we are not committed to going beyond? How do we share love with people who still need our love and support? The family members who are struggling with addiction, the person who seems like the archetypal biblical sinner, on and on. Too many people treat love like money. I will invest some of my capital in you as long as I get back enough to make a profit. But love is not something you show a person to reward them for having behaved in a manner you approve. When people do things wrong, that's usually when your love is the most necessary, the most needed. In Sarah and The Heart is Deceitful Above All Things, my books, I wrote a painful dynamic between mother and son. The mother has been damaged by life and is desperate and has limited resources, is not much more than a child herself. And because of all of that, she can be abusive and abandoning. And these books show us how her son comes to love her, even as she disappears from his life. Earlier, I said that transgressive behavior can open the door to think in a new way. With the J.T. Leroy novels, I allowed readers to feel a connection to a person they may have prided themselves on being totally unlike, someone unfamiliar to them, whom they had no interest in, except maybe to feel disgust or pity, a young, gender-variant truck stop prostitute. But in my novel, Sarah, they could find a commonality. The same sorrows, the same movement toward love, the same search for love, and the need to give love. I'm going to share with you an excerpt from Sarah, an audiobook of the novel that was recently released with the brilliant actor Winsome Brown. At this point in the story, the narrator is on the run. He's been rescued from captivity, but they're being pursued as they speed in a truck heading toward a bridge. The bridge crosses a haunted river, and if you don't hold your breath, you could wind up joining the dead in its waters. So the narrator is holding his breath as they careen across the bridge, and he has a vision of his mother.
I see Sarah's face as I cradled it once when she had stopped breathing, the needle still stuck in her arm, leaking like a red ink pen. I held my breath as the paramedics worked on her until she rose with a sudden thrust like a seedling pushing its head up out of the dirt in a speeded-up nature film. She looked at me, her eyes wild with the secrets of death, and said, "I came back for you." She never spoke those words again, even when she did always come back for me, claiming me nonchalantly like a forgotten scarf at a coat check from the various group homes or foster care in the various states I'd been relinquished to when a new marriage that had seemed promising turned as useless as the fruit of a poisoned sumac. In my head, I assure the dead, my resolve to be with my mother is all the air my lungs require. I open my eyes and see the ivory Turk's cap lilies waving at the end of the bridge like a crowd of monks' white hoods bowing a somber surrender flag. "Why do you always come back for me?" I had asked her once when she lay on the bed in the tenuous world of alcohol-induced consciousness. She slowly rolled her head to me, flopped an arm over the back of my neck, and pulled me closer, as if she were pulling in one poker chips. "Everybody needs someone to know who they really are." She laughed and guided my head down to lie next to hers. The white of the lilies grows as searing as the ache of the air pressing to escape my lungs. "I know who you are," I say, gasping, and let the lonely dead drag me down.
I've called this talk Rethinking Transgression. And because transgression is an attempt to rethink what you believe the boundaries are. That means I'm being that means I'm being transgressive about being sorry, hearing Winsome just always blows me away. I'm being transgressive about transgression. There's something very useful about this impulse if I can even express it. Let's look at this flyer here for this symposium, which lists topics for discussion. Transgressive religion, transgressive arts, sexual transgression, cultural transgression, gender transgression, and see, there at the end, the last one, positive transgression. So there's an immediate implication that all these forms of transgression are negative, right? That happens because the subject of transgression invariably provokes a certain automatic discomfort and invariably excites a special kind of interest as well. That part of ourselves which is attracted and might feel gratified to see a taboo violated, or at least is curious and wants to know more. Gender variance in particular excites these conflicting responses of discomfort and interest, which can be seen in the hostility that is a fixture of some political parties. Certain people will fixate on other people's gender situations, and the fears exposed by that fixation are very revealing. The nail that sticks up must be hammered down, to quote an old Japanese adage. A lot of rationalizations get offered as to why is it so essential to hammer down that nail. Most tend to devolve along the lines of, what if everyone ran around doing that? You see the depth of fear with transgressive behavior, because what the so-called norm is in gender or sexuality or art or religion or whatever that norm we are told is something proper and right and by the laws of man and God. Yet the norm must be something totally unnatural if any instance of transgressive behavior can shake its foundations. The norm must be something extremely unpopular if everyone would just soon run around doing something that is not the norm. And again, there are corporate interests profiting off the norm. And they don't like anyone to shake it. They know that the norm keeps shifting, and they try to keep up with it, but they would prefer not to launch a new ad campaign if they don't have to. After the murder of George Floyd, many corporations and politicians paid lip service to supporting Black Lives Matter, but few pursued fundamental changes. What's needed is to be serious and objective about the realities that exist around us. And we see that gender, which is multifaceted, is not being dealt with seriously and objectively. Instead, it's being reduced to something simpler. That reduction of our understanding has its roots in the effort to exert control over the behavior of people. What's needed is our capacity for observation to discern what is actually going on. This is particularly true of gender and what we regard as gender transgression. Joanne Prinzivalli is a trans woman, an activist, and the founder of New York transgender rights organization Nitro. I want to show you the working model of gender which she outlined. The reason people get confused about gender is because they take something multifaceted and treat it as if it wasn't multifaceted. The same thing happens with sound, with what we hear. So let me digress briefly into the facts about what sound is. This is going to pay off. Just bear with me. When an orchestra is about to perform, one musician, usually the oboe will play A above C, and all the other musicians will tune their instruments to that A. They call this pitch A440 because that sound is vibrating at the speed of 440 beats per second, thus producing the pitch that we know is A above middle C. But more is going on than a simple frequency of sounds of 440 beats per second. In order for it to be a sound, it also has to have a duration. It must exist in time. It must start and stop. The third parameter of sound is its dynamic level, the degree of loudness or softness, its volume, and it also has to have a kind of timbre, a tone color. You can hear the pitch, A440, for 2 seconds at the same volume, and it will sound different if it's played by an oboe or a violin. So that pitch, which we call A above middle C, is actually a four-sided event of frequency, duration, dynamics, and timbre. Remove any one of those parameters and there is no sound. For a sound to exist, it has to have a certain frequency, some extent of duration, a specific level of volume, and a tone color of some kind. And awareness of the reality of what sound is fucking important. It's especially fucking important to anyone who has a serious interest in how the ear works and what we hear. That interest can be medical, it can be concerned with audio engineering, but they will be aware of the reality of what sound is. And then there are composers and musicians and people who record and work with sound, who are also concerned with all the parameters of fucking sound. An awareness of the reality of what gender is even more important because we're all involved in that. And like sound, gender is also a four-sided event. Yet we tend to confuse a single aspect of it for the whole. The single aspect is assignment. The doctor looks between an infant's legs and checks one of two boxes, female or M, F for female, M for male. The overemphasis on assignment has caused people to ignore the crucial parameter of identity, who you know you are regardless of what anyone else tells you. Back in 1965, a male infant was born in Canada, and he was brought in for routine circumcision. But the procedure was so horribly botched that they had to amputate the child's penis. His distraught parents went to the top man at Johns Hopkins Hospital in the United States, a psychologist and sexologist named John Money. His expert medical advice was for the parents to have the rest of the child's genitalia removed. Let the doctors fashion a vagina and raise the child as a female. The parents followed the doctor's instructions, but despite everything they did to reinforce this gender role, it didn't work. The child grew up desperately unhappy, yet Dr. Money kept reporting the success his patient's female life was, even though he'd seen it was a fucking disaster. By adolescence, the child was suicidal. Not until the age of 14 did the parents admit what had actually happened. He'd immediately transitioned back to male. However, he had undergone so much suffering and interference and betrayal and dishonesty, such physical and psychological damage and trauma, that eventually he couldn't go on. And in his 30s, he took his own life. This appalling medical scandal was totally unknown until it made headlines in 1998. Here's a picture. A trans or gender variant person could have told Dr. Money and the so-called expert at Johns fucking Hopkins that their advice for their child would never fucking work. Because identity is real. Who you know you are is a real thing. That's why the parameter of identity is very concerning to trans people and gender variant people. This is where identity conflicts with assignment. Sorry, this shit makes me emotional. Along with assignment and identity, there is also the third parameter of gender, your presentation. When you show people, what you show people as you move through the world. Gender is not just a medical definition or a self-awareness, it is a personal expression, a social activity as well. The English language may not be as gendered as other languages, but here in the US, just about everything else that we deal regarding ourselves is gendered. What we consume, what we utilize to present ourselves to each other, as I mentioned earlier, is highly regimented in terms of gender because gender is played out socially. So check this out. It's easy to find in advertising gender-neutral products, from automobiles to shampoo, that are gendered and pitched to specific markets. And when these products are pitched at women, they cost more. It's called a pink tax. The fourth parameter of gender is your, I can't get over that female hammer. Okay, great. The fourth parameter of gender is your orientation, your sexuality, your attractions, your activities. That is the other level in which we experience and express our gender. So, just as we needed a four-sided model to understand what sound is, so too we require this four-sided model of gender if we are to understand what gender means for people. The four-sided model of gender has always existed, provided it was filled out only in one of two ways. If you were assigned female, then your identity must be female, and your presentation must be female, and it was automatically assumed your orientation must be toward men. And if you, showing you charts here, and if you were assigned male, then your orientation must be male, and your presentation must be male, so your orientation was assumed to be toward women. So what we have been left with is a two-sided model of gender. This model has ordinarily been held up to us as the sum total of goodness and reality, despite the rest of the world that exists outside of it, which has always existed. Apparently, in every culture, in every era, there is an entire library of books studying gender variance and homosexuality throughout human history. Libraries. So many books. The problem with the two-part model of gender is that it doesn't fucking work. Too much gendered activity occurs outside of it. Here's another chart for you. There are plenty of women who are assigned female at birth, identify as female, and present as female, but their orientation is toward women. And there are plenty of men who are assigned male at birth, identify as male, and present as male, but their orientation is toward men. Orientation, however, is not limited to M or F. There are plenty of people, all of whom are consistent in their assignment, identity, and presentation, who are attracted to both men and women. And there are also those people who are equally consistent who are attracted to neither. For any individual, the field of orientation of sexual attraction offers one of four options: female, male, both, neither. This is equally true of the field of presentation. People frequently present as neither. I can't tell the gender of a person who's inside a hazmat suit or a space suit or certain military uniforms, police uniforms, firefighter uniforms. The act of presenting as both, showing male and female qualities, can happen simultaneously, or it can be alternated. There are numerous shamanistic traditions and ancient religions religious practices led by people wearing male and female clothes, signifying that they walk between the worlds of male and female, of the living and the dead, of the material and spiritual. We see the same dual presentation, how people play with fashion and fashion trends, how they blur and blend genders. There's also the growing frequency of gender variant models, both on the runways and in advertising and TV, everywhere. The Australian supermodel Andrea Pejic came out as a trans woman in 2013. That's her, both pictures. Before that, working as a male, she would model both men and women's clothes. In this trick photograph, Pejic is shown as both genders. The presentation of both can occur alternately, as with the person who cross-dresses on occasion for personal tastes or professional reasons or whatever. There can be all sorts of reasons. Jean Beret, gotta work on my French, was the first woman to circumnavigate the globe in the 1760s, and the only way she could be part of such an expedition in those days was by pretending to be a man. In the 1890s and 1900s, the Swiss writer Isabel Eberhardt frequently traveled as a man as she journeyed through Islamic northern Africa, where a woman could not go unveiled or by herself. There are numerous examples over the centuries of women who got to traverse the world as men. Any one of the four options, both, neither, female, male, is valid for orientation and for presentation. It is also true that both and neither are valid for identity and for assignment, just as much as female and male are. This reality becomes apparent as soon as you do any research into the subject of intersexuality. You discover immediately how ramified it is, how pervasive and frequent being intersex actually is. According to Planned Parenthood, about 1 in 2 in 100 people born in the U.S. are intersex. It's estimated around 1.7%, which means we're talking over 5 million people. Again, just in this country alone, there's more, that's more than the population of the state of Utah, which is around 3.2 million people. Planned Parenthood also pointed out that there are different ways in which a person can be intersex. For some intersex people, their external genitalia or their internal sex organs fall outside the male or female categories, such as a person with both ovarian and testicular issues. Other intersex people have a combination of chromosomes that are different, and some people are born with external genitals that fall into typical male-female categories, but their internal organs or hormones don't. Human Rights Watch became concerned about the horrifying mistreatment so many intersex people are subjected to. And in 2017, they reported that with infants who are intersex, around 1 in 2,000 babies is different enough that doctors may recommend surgical intervention. 1 out of every 2,000 for the U.S. population alone. That's more than 160,000 people, close to the population of Salt Lake City. And when surgical procedures of so-called normalization are performed on intersex babies, patients who are too young to give consent, they run the risk of complications such as scarring, sterilization, incontinence, loss of sexual sensation, and psychological trauma. And so today there is an active movement at work to end unnecessary surgical interventions on intersex children. If we can let intersex people live their own lives and they can show us what it means to be intersex and pick their own categories. This working model of gender understands what intersex means, because Whether the parameter is assignment, identity, presentation, or orientation, for every person, there is one of four options available: female, male, both, or neither. Employing this model, we can recognize literally any form of human gender expression. No one is omitted from the circle. That's because it's called a working model of gender, because it works. This model is gender, just as a four-sided model of sound is sound. And if this model is what we understand gender to be for people, then we have to challenge, is it even possible to be gender transgressive? How does one transgress against the model? What is it that you are? What is it that you do? What is it not? What is not understood by this model? The reason people get confused about gender is because they are taking something multifaceted and dealing with it as though it wasn't. I was describing before how among doctors and engineers and musicians and composers, there are people who deal with sound in a serious way, with a full understanding of it being a four-sided event. And if you're serious about what gender is, you will deal with it in its full understanding of you'll deal with it in the full understanding of gender being a four-sided event, which means that the people who attempt to impose their rules and strictures regarding gender are not serious about what gender is, because they ignore the fact that gender is multifaceted. They don't think about gender seriously. And they do not have a serious understanding of it. They reserve their seriousness for something else, exerting control over the way people think and behave. How else can they control a market for what they're selling? In my own life, I've experienced instances of people who have never met me writing about how they think I identify. That's even been done by people who are within the queer community and who should know better than to make such presumptions about others. I reserve for myself the right to identify as I please, and for that to be open. And when I read someone casting me in a specific role without any awareness of who I am, I know they're not serious about me or my writing. What they're serious is about what they're trying to sell. There exists a fear that regards gender transgression as a negative. As we discussed with the poster for this symposium, I hope this talk helps you appreciate. If you seriously study gender, these transgressions won't be seen as negative, that it will seem absurd to regard them as negative. They might always be regarded as transgressive, or we might get beyond that, but they need not provoke fear or be met with repression or interference or aggressions. I want to thank you all for having me join you today and for listening so fucking patiently. Thank you.
Phone and get your questions. Okay, first off, this is from Nate. What do you think students can do to help us understand the world better and live happier lives? And then he says, let me rephrase that. What do you think we can do as students to try and live happier lives and understand the world better?
I'll just tell you, for me, I try to avoid social media. I notice when I'm on social media is presented as a way, especially in the pandemic, it was our way to see the world, and it's it it's a distortion. I mean, we're all curating bullshit, and so sometimes again and again, it's just bringing me back to trying to be present. There's this book it recently was released, and it was a man who survived the Holocaust and keeping himself alive during it. He realized what he needed to do was find meaning every single day, to find meaning in being of service to others. And he ended up, he was a doctor before, and he became a psychiatrist, I believe. And anyway, his book is on the bestseller list. Again, I wish I had it for you, but it's easy to find. Do you remember his name?
Viktor Frankl.
Victor Frankl, our team in the home office. Victor Frankl. So it's finding meaning. And I think it's the having an organizing principle that that you are not living in the illusion of isolation of self. And social media really reinforces that illusion of isolation of self by constantly feeling that it's despair, compare and despair. So that's my answer. Next.
Perfect. We're looking for more questions.
Any other questions, you
Oh,
guys?
drag them out from the
Comments?
street.
They're dumbfounded. Questions, comments, you guys?
Just start calling on
I've
people.
got a
That's
question
what-
for you, Laura,
that's what I
actually.
do.
Second best.
So as someone who identifies as, you know, a straight white male, how can I be more, I guess, more of an ally to my friends and potentially family who identify in a way that is contrary to what society is pushing forward?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, because it's so where you're located. Like if you, some schools, it obviously you're in an area where the majority it's seen as a negative. I think it's just letting someone know that there it's just not an issue. It's not like you don't have to signal in any way, but it's you know what I think is like the most important thing is, hang on, technical. It's just like asking someone to it's like I always there's a lot of thing of like it's not my burden to educate you kind of thing, but it also is, you know, it constantly is. And it's sometimes you'll meet someone who might get super offended if you use the wrong pronoun. And I think it's just going and saying, you know, I'm trying to learn. This isn't, it's like if you were going to France and, you know, well, the French get really like, they don't like when you fuck up their language. If you go to Mexico, I was botching language so badly, but there was a generosity towards like, wow, you're trying. And I think it's going to someone saying, I'm trying, and I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. I really am coming in good faith. And that has and everything to do with all kinds of areas where you don't know and it's different to you. And I think that is what people appreciate. But that's a good question. And I think people get afraid. Like, I know sometimes it's like, I'm going to fuck up. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to use the wrong pronoun. And sometimes that happens. You do. You're looking for a cue, and someone, there's anyway, yeah, it's just saying I'm coming in good faith.
Laura, that was fantastic. Thank you for saying all the right things. I really appreciate
I don't know if I
it.
did that, but I wasn't trying to.
You should all go out and read all of Laura's work, by the way. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Laura. I'll be in touch soon.
Thank you so much for, again, I really appreciate, and I really appreciate the openness that everyone coming here had. And it takes a willingness to be open. And I'll just really encourage everyone to be willing to let go of your shame and know that, like, even just doing this talk, I was, well, what if I fuck up and this and that? And it's the idea of that instead of I made a mistake, you feel like you are a mistake. And that's like your intense shame that pretty much all of us are born with. And being willing to go beyond, transgress your inner inbuilt shame. It's all right. They can exist along with moving forward, being available to spirit and the orchestra.
Awesome. Thank you again, Laura. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Booyakasha.
Have a good night, Laura. You did awesome.
This is great.
Thank you.